All right, so we're going to continue to talk about injuries, discomfort, pain, tissue damage, and all that with training. And this time we're going to focus in on people's expectations surrounding what their body should feel like when they're exercising, right? And how those expectations can impact their results in training and also impact their ability to recover from injuries, their ability to train around things that may be, more minor, all that kind of stuff, right? And this isn't necessarily some sort of Deepak Chopra, quantum weirdness visualization type of thing, but someone's expectations do make a pretty big difference in terms of how they interpret pain signals. This is actually coming from their body. So if we are thinking about coaching athletes, if we're athletes ourselves and we're doing a lot of training and we're starting to experience some sort of, elbow tendonitis, plantar fasciitis, whatever, or maybe something potentially more serious, the way that we think about what this means for us in our training, the way that we think about what's actually happening to our body, all that stuff really does make an impact. So, Luke, what do you see from people? Sometimes it can be a little bit of an issue with how they think about, their elbow starting to hurt when they do too many pull-ups. What are the misaligned expectations that you see from some of the folks who you're coaching?
Before I get into it, you might hear some drilling or some hammering, or basically an apartment 2 floors below me is getting completely rebuilt. So there might be a bit of some construction noise. But anyway,
I thought you were in a dentist's office and that was tooth drilling.
Yeah, that's a big tooth drill. But I think going back to your point around the expectations of what people are looking at in terms of managing injuries whilst playing a sport, or whilst obviously doing a sport like CrossFit, I think a lot of the time people carry in similar expectations to what they may have gone through when they were, say for example, if they were just training for sort of health and fitness beforehand, and then as soon as they go into the sort of sports world and competitive training, they approach it in a similar way, and they expect that they're going to have a sort of a similar experience on that front. So generally speaking, if you have someone who's general population, just looking to be fit, looking to be healthy, there are certain things that you're always going to be able to do and change in their training to make sure that they're able to get what they want. Whereas when you are playing a sport and you are doing something such as CrossFit, you have to practice certain things. You have to be doing certain things. And I think sometimes, you can make adjustments into someone's training, but there is going to be an element of working through maybe some discomfort, working through some movements, which might not be like a complete ideal situation. And part of that is because they're wanting to compete in the sport and they're wanting to develop in the sport. But at the same time, certain things as well, you're going to have to take a bit of time off of it, let that thing, calm down a little bit. You're probably going to have to include some sort of work to make you a little bit more resilient and try to avoid those situations from happening in the future. And then you may have to start working through the movement and repatterning it a little bit differently. But at the same time, there might be some discomfort. There might be a little bit of pain that you're having to experience as you're going through it. I mean, I think one of the, easiest examples is, what you often hear with the difference between someone having tendonitis and someone having a tendinopathy. So tendonitis being, say, for example, an inflammation in the soft tissue in a certain area of your body, tendinopathy being essentially the chronic version of that. So something whereby you're experiencing that for a long time. And what I've often heard sort of physios tell me is that when you have something that is more of a tendinopathy and it's a chronic issue, you have to work through it and you have to try to sort of find a way of managing it, and also making sure that you're still practicing it, especially if that's something that you want to do. So I think that if you are competing in the sport, it's about trying to understand, okay, well, what is the level of risk that I'm sort of willing to take, but at the same time, understanding long-term performance and understanding what you need to do to make sure that you are continuously improving. You're not digging yourself into too much of a hole by sort of just pushing through pain. So please don't hear what I just said as basically just training through everything that hurts.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Luke, is that especially with competitive athletes, the two major errors that people make are the extremes of either of those things, right? Like you said, it's people who are like, okay, no pain, no gain. Like we just have to get after it no matter what's going on. And that those folks tend to disregard signals that are pretty obvious and important, where it's like, oh yeah, every time I do this overhead squat, it feels like my shoulder's going to dislocate. Oh, well, no pain, no gain. And it's like, okay, if you feel like your shoulder is going to dislocate, that's probably something to react to, right? Whereas other people potentially have like, oh, like I'm starting to get this little bit of pain in here. I don't know if it's okay. Like, is my technique all right? I'm doing something wrong. I'm going to dislocate my elbow. This is not good. I need to, like stop doing this. I need to rest. Like, and it's just like, hey man, that's going to happen sometimes if you're training to compete in a sport. So the balance between avoiding those two overreactions on either side of experiencing some sort of discomfort is kind of like what we're shooting for, I think.
I think it's important to differentiate there between the people training for competitive CrossFit and people just training in a CrossFit gym. The risk of injury to a quite regular person in the gym should be lower than a competitive athlete. And there's less need for them to push to a point where they might get injured. Whereas a competitive athlete having to, push those boundaries in loading and volume and training under fatigue is going to put them at a higher risk for injury.
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit in the last episode too, where if someone is competitive, their goal is to maximize their performance, and the way you do that is by pushing the volume and the intensity of what you're doing, close to your ability to tolerate it. And as you do that, you're obviously putting yourself in a position where you're potentially going to be causing more tissue damage, potentially going to be putting yourself in more situations where you might have some sort of ongoing issue. And John, like you said, that's not necessary for someone whose goal is to just work out consistently, show up to the gym 3 times a week for 6 months, for 6 years, whatever. It's like, okay, we don't need to push you to that point. But Luke, to kind of circle back to what you're saying just about, people potentially having misaligned expectations about what their training experience is going to be like. What do you see from athletes in terms of the way that they are anticipating their training is going to go, right? Because I think that one of the things that I see from people is that they're not anticipating that there's going to be obstacles, and then they get like completely thrown at the most predictable things that happen, right? It's like, okay, like I'm finally going to buckle down. I'm going to do all my training. I'm not going to be injured. Everything is going to be perfect. And then in 4 weeks, it's like my elbow's a little bit achy and I had to travel for work. Like everything is ruined and I'm screwed. And it's like, those are the most predictable things ever, right? Like you have a busy job and your elbows bother you when you do too many pull-ups. Like, of course this is going to happen. So just having an expectation ahead of time of what might be coming down the pipeline in terms of obstacles that you're going to have to deal with, I think is really, really important for people. So I guess I'm curious, like, do you communicate that to people? Is that something that that folks kind of get like reactive with? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I think sometimes I try to get people to try and anticipate the things that are going to come up and the obstacles that are going to potentially occur. Sometimes you sort of do see, okay, maybe a bit of training got missed. Maybe they've been a bit inconsistent with training, and then they sort of jump into their training and they expect that they're going to hit the same numbers that they did before. Like I have a general rule. I try to make sure that if people have time off training, it's like, okay, just try to approach things at, say, more of a 90%, in week 1, and then maybe in week 2, you can sort of get back to usual expectations. But a lot of the time it's just, sometimes it can be just a bit haphazard and a bit, okay, well, yeah, this is going to work if I, throw all the weight on the barbell and, I go through as many reps as I can unbroken to start off with. It's just like, sometimes you just need to hold people back and give them guidelines as to what they're going to go through. But yeah, like you were saying, sometimes an injury or something like that, or just maybe a bit of an issue can cause a bit of stress around the training, and then you see a bit of demotivation in the training, then they skip the training, and it's like, sometimes the worst thing you can do in these situations is just completely just rest and just completely go off it. There is usually something that you can do, and I think it's important that people try to find a way of, working around it, whether it means you actually have to rest that area of your body and you end up having to focus your training elsewhere, but just something to keep you engaged. And instead of it just sort of being like, I'm injured, I'm not training, or I'm traveling, I can't train. It's just having the ability to turn that dial up and down, because I think when people do sort of expect this linear progress and they do expect to come back from time away and just jump back into training as normal, that's when you're going to have issues arise, and that's when they're not accumulating good training, and a lot of the time as well, just accumulating those training hours, it teaches you a lot as well. It's not just about what it's doing to your body physiologically, but you're sort of going to come across these sort of mini barriers within your training and these obstacles, and then being able to deal with that on a daily basis, weekly basis, monthly, but like eventually that allows you to be able to cope with the bigger stuff, and it allows you to be able to work around the bigger stuff. Whereas, like you were saying, you sort of, people tend to catastrophize things, and whether it's like a movement in training that's not going well, or whether it's like a small little injury, and it a lot of the time it is part of the process. Without sounding like some inspirational YouTube video, the sort of failures and the obstacles and those types of things are going to allow you to have learning, and then be able to manage those situations in the future better. But I think that the one thing I sort of do see is people don't necessarily understand how they just try to compartmentalize things a bit too much. This could probably be, also seen in the way they view training. But if they have an injury in one area of their body, I think a lot of the time people don't understand and don't expect that to come up elsewhere, or, certain things like that. If you don't necessarily go about things properly, if you don't rehab things properly. And one of the things I find that's really popular these days is, this idea of bulletproofing, which, there is merit to it, but a lot of the time it's, okay, we're just going to hammer volume in a certain area of your body to get you resilient. And, sometimes it's like, well, the issue is bigger than that. And people don't necessarily look deep enough into actually what's going on and the sort of reasons for that. And sometimes that's really difficult because, they just feel like, I need to strengthen this area, or I need to stretch this area, and it tends to be the area which they've also injured, and it could be something else. So I think if people could try to calm down a little bit, just sort of turn the dial up and down as opposed to turning it on and off, and then also try to also understand that a lot of these issues can be linked with other things, whether it's movement, things going on in the body, whether it's some lifestyle factors, and just, maybe just sort of taking a bit of a step away from the issue so they can just try to sort of process it a little bit easier and make a bit more sense of it.
I think, you say catastrophize? I don't think that's a real word.
Todd was using it whilst we were talking earlier, so I wrote it down. All right.
Yeah, it's a CBT concept, John. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which you need for your depression, John.
Listen, if you've got word of the day toilet paper, and that's okay, but that doesn't make it right. But no, I mean, I think on that kind of bulletproofing line, Luke, I think there is something to be said for improving resilience in areas that have the opportunity to be weakened or injured more readily by overuse. But I think it has to be balanced out with the rest of the training volume. So, you take shoulders, a lot of CrossFitters, especially like higher performing CrossFitters or people that do a lot of volume, they tend to get these shoulder issues, whether it's just a straight injury, whether it's overuse, whether it's instability. And I think there is something to be said for bulletproofing, but I think what a lot of people fall into is they try and do all this bulletproofing type stuff without adjusting the volume of what they're doing in other areas of their training. So, they're doing crossover symmetry work before or after a workout where they've done, 50 wall walks or whatever it is. And it's like, okay, there's merit to doing the crossover symmetry. There's merit to strengthening around the shoulder, but you're trying to do this work under fatigue, or you're fatiguing yourself prior to doing shoulder work, which is leading you to either, excessive volume or injury while training. So I am a big fan of bulletproofing type stuff, as long as it's used appropriately with the.
What about bulletproof coffee?
Honestly, did that concept for a while back in, I want to say 2012 was the old butter
How was
in
your
the coffee.
mental acuity?
Sat on the toilet a lot.
I seem to remember it gave me like a sore throat when I drank it, like blending butter into coffee, but then like it just kind of like sticks to your throat.
I definitely had that with MCT oil. Like at some point, one of my clients gave me some MCT oil and I was like, yeah, sure. Like I'll try this or whatever. And then, like made my throat hurt in a really strange way. I was like, I don't really like this. What's going on?
Yeah.
I was just going to...
You can continue your thought. I just had to insert Dave Asprey into the conversation. To be clear, I have a very bad opinion of Dave Asprey, by the way. Like that, I think most of the stuff that we talk badly about on this podcast, well, maybe not most, but Dave Asprey is a sort of symbol of many of the kinds of wrong think that we try to rail against. So down with Dave.
Well, one thing I was just going to add with the bulletproofing idea is, like, you're completely right with it. Sometimes it's a stress on the body. It's a novel stress on the body. You're trying to do something, and but one of the things I do think happens a lot is there's people who have misaligned expectations with the effectiveness of it, and you have you have out there now these sort of gurus who are trying to get people to be like, yeah, you need to be able to do this to be able to do this before you do this, and it's like, okay, so you're telling me. I would just say, the one of the examples, without actually bashing him, because I do think that there's a lot of value to the stuff that he puts out there, is like knees over toe guy. With a lot of the stuff that he puts out, sometimes I feel like that can create a bit of an expectation as to, okay, well, if I'm able to do this like mini step up with my body weight for 10 reps, then that means I'm like world-class strength level for this, that, and the other, and then there's an expectation that like they're going to be able to withstand wear and tear that occurs with sport, whether that's going to be a field sport or whether that's going to be doing high volume squatting within CrossFit and all this type of thing. It's because there's an element to it where it's like, as soon as you start specializing in that way, it's just sort of almost defeats the object of doing it, right? Because you're trying to get better at stuff, or you're trying to improve at something in order to get better at the task, and then sometimes it just turns into just focusing on getting better at stuff. And I suppose, I know many people who have competed in CrossFit, got injured, found out about Ido Portal's stuff, and then next thing you know, they're just crawling on the floor in all these weird ways for their whole training session, which is cool. But it's like, that there's an element to it which a lot of that bulletproofing stuff, I think sometimes it can just create, it's not misguided. I understand they need to try to create buy-in when they're sort of putting these things together, but I think a lot of people overvalue them quite a lot.
Yeah, Luke, I think that go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, like, along that kind of Ido Portal route, I always have a hesitancy or slight mistrust in people who put 100% of their focus on one aspect of training. And, you need some, the kind of Ido Portal stuff or whatever, you need someone to have gone 100% in on that to create that kind of thing. But then you need people to be diverse enough in their training that they're doing more than just that. And even the same as CrossFit, I don't think that just the pure original form of what CrossFit was is, an ideal way to train. There has to be diversification in what people are doing, and people who are like, I'm going to do this bulletproof shoulders program and I'm going to do it every day and it's going to be great. And it's like, well, no, you need to be doing stuff like that's a good basis, but you need other stuff built around it. The same with the kind of Ido Portal stuff or, squat university stuff. Like people who go so deep on one thing that is their entire basis for training, I think is a kind of dangerous road to go down.
Well, yeah, and I think it also depends on what the goal is, right? If we're talking about this through the lens of someone who's a CrossFit athlete looking to improve at the sport of CrossFit, like both of you are saying, there's this sort of, I don't know what the right word is, because I don't even think it's a shortcut because people want to work hard on it. But it's this misconception that like, oh, once I can do, this, I can get this score on the functional movement screen and I can do this many Powell raises with this percentage of my bench press and I can get my knee into this position or whatever, that all of a sudden I'm going to be really good at CrossFit. And it just doesn't work that way, right? Like you have to do the actual thing to get good at the actual thing. That said, if there are people who, I think you mentioned this, Luke, who are just like, you know what, I'm like kind of burnt out on thrusters and pull-ups and I'm just going to do weird animal crawls all the time. Like, yeah, sure. Great. Like, I think that's completely fine. But the misconception that doing weird animal crawls is going to be this like incredible boon to your CrossFit abilities, I think that just isn't there. Like, yes, on the margins, can some people who have a need for that kind of thing get some specific benefit to certain movement patterns that will improve their resilience and tissue tolerance over time? Absolutely, right? For people who are already doing high volume training, and John, you sort of started to touch on this, right? Is doing some additional accessory work as a way to add volume to their training without just doing more wall walks and more thrusters and more pull-ups when they're already kind of like towing the line in terms of how much they can tolerate there. Yes, for sure. Right. And I think that's why you see a lot of more competitive athletes doing a lot of this accessory work is like, they just want to add volume to their training sessions. And at some point it's like, hey, we can't just do more CrossFit, but we want to do more stuff. And we can also make this like a little bit aerobic if we're a little bit creative with it. Like, that's a great way to just keep adding volume to people's training. So if we kind of zoom out, though, I think that the discussion that we're having on resilience is very, very relevant. And we're sort of talking about it in a very zoomed in way on like tissue tolerance. Can we improve the resilience of the shoulder girdle? Can we improve the resilience of the hip joint? Like all this stuff. Like, yes, absolutely. This is great. But then to sort of circle back to what we were talking about earlier, right? We also want to improve the resilience of the person to potential obstacles coming up, right? To potential injuries starting to pop up, to potential overuse injuries starting to get noticed, right? And so pretty much everything we're doing at every layer of thinking about training is, can we put this person in a situation where they have to learn and improvise a little bit? And can we, over time, improve their resilience, either from a tissue level, from a sort of like discomfort during exercise level, from a sort of macro perspective of like handling obstacles in your lifestyle and training, in a sort of mid-tier level of like, you're in a competition, you're starting to get no reps, you're in a competition and you went out a little bit too hot. Can you recover as you're continuing to exercise, right? Like, these are all the pieces of resilience that we're trying to train. And almost everything we're doing is like creating scenarios to help build that for people. And so, the idea of like injuries and pain and all that sort of stuff, right? We want to make an individual resilient in their tissue, in their mindset, and their approach to obstacles, and to how they handle when things go wrong. And I think that's really the best way as a coach or as an athlete to think about like attacking this kind of stuff.